Hey my friend, I'm glad you made it here tonight. I hope your day wasn't too heavy, although if your mind is still replaying tomorrow's to-do list, or that one slightly awkward conversation from 3 years ago, don't worry. Brains have always been wonderfully talented at staying busy when the rest of us would very much like to sleep. So, let's make a little agreement. For the next while, you don't have to solve anything. Let your shoulders relax. Unclench your jaw. Let your breathing slow down just a little. Tonight, instead of worrying about modern life, we're going to spend some quiet time with one of the most ordinary and surprisingly fascinating objects in medieval Europe. Not a king's jeweled crown, not a legendary sword pulled from a stone, just a small knife. And as strange as it sounds, this humble piece of sharpened metal may have been one of the most important possessions an ordinary person ever owned. If you asked someone today what comes to mind when they hear the phrase medieval knife, they would probably picture a dramatic duel, a cloaked assassin lurking in an alley, or perhaps an angry knight settling an argument in the least constructive way imaginable. Medieval films have done an impressive job convincing us that nearly every sharp object existed solely to support somebody's poor anger management skills. The reality, as history often enjoys reminding us, was far less glamorous and considerably more practical. For the average medieval European, a knife was less like a weapon and more like what your smartphone is today. It went almost everywhere with you. You felt slightly uncomfortable if you forgot it. It solved dozens of tiny daily problems. It became worn exactly where your hand gripped it. And if someone borrowed it without asking, there was a very good chance you became mildly irritated. Except, unlike a smartphone, this little tool could also slice bread, repair clothing, trim wood, cut rope, prepare dinner, peel apples, clean fish, carve spoons, sharpen sticks, and occasionally remind an aggressive goose that personal boundaries were important. It was in many ways the ultimate multi-tool long before anyone thought of marketing such a thing. Imagine waking in a small English village sometime during the late 13th century. The sun has barely climbed above the rooftops. Thin smoke curls from chimneys. Roosters proudly announce accomplishments that mostly involve being awake before everyone else. Somewhere nearby, a cow voices an opinion that nobody requested. You stretch-pull on a simple wool tunic, tighten your belt, and before stepping outside, you reach automatically for one object. Not your shoes, not your hat, your knife. Without thinking much about it, you slide it into a leather sheath hanging from your belt. Only then does the day truly begin. This tiny routine happened countless millions of times across medieval Europe. Men carried knives, women carried knives, merchants carried knives, farmers carried knives, pilgrims carried knives. Children often carried small knives once they reached an appropriate age to handle one responsibly, or at least as responsibly as medieval parents hoped. In fact, finding an adult without a knife would have seemed slightly unusual, not suspicious, simply inconvenient. Because almost every activity during the day eventually required cutting something. Modern kitchens quietly hide this reality. Open a drawer today, and you might discover 10 different knives, one for vegetables, one for bread, one for meat, one that nobody remembers buying, but everyone assumes belongs there. Medieval households often relied on far fewer tools. A personal knife traveled with its owner. Rather than waiting politely inside a kitchen drawer, it accompanied its human companion through fields, forests, markets, churches, workshops, and long muddy roads. One knife, hundreds of jobs. Its design reflected this remarkable versatility. Most everyday knives were modest in size. The blade might measure only 4 to 7 inches long, large enough to accomplish practical tasks, small enough to carry comfortably all day. The handles varied enormously depending on wealth. Poorer people often used plain wood, simple, functional, easy to replace. Wealthier owners sometimes chose polished antler, carved bone ivory, or finely decorated hardwoods. Some handles displayed elegant geometric patterns. Others featured tiny carved animals or religious symbols. A few wealthy nobles commissioned astonishing craftsmanship, transforming an ordinary tool into something almost artistic. Even then, however, beauty rarely replaced usefulness. Unlike ceremonial swords hanging untouched on castle walls, these knives actually worked for a living. After all, there was little point decorating a handle if the blade itself refused to cut yesterday's rather stubborn loaf of rye bread. Interestingly, medieval people often cared for these knives almost the way modern people care for quality pocket knives today. Blades required sharpening, rust demanded attention, leather sheaths wore out, wooden handles cracked. Repairing a favorite knife often made far more sense than replacing it. Metal remained expensive. Skilled blacksmiths required time. A dependable knife represented investment rather than disposable convenience. It quietly accumulated memories, tiny scratches from preparing hundreds of meals, worn edges from carving wooden bowls, dark stains from years of handling, perhaps one small notch left by an unfortunate encounter with particularly determined firewood. History has a funny habit of surviving in these tiny imperfections. Now imagine lunchtime. A traveler stops beside a roadside inn. Several strangers share one long wooden table. Bowls of thick stew appear. Large chunks of coarse bread arrive. Someone carries roasted meat from the kitchen. Modern diners instinctively reach for forks. Our medieval traveler reaches for his own knife, because the inn probably provides none. This surprises many people today. Table forks existed in parts of Europe, especially in wealthy Byzantine and Italian circles, but they remained remarkably uncommon throughout much of medieval Western Europe. Many people viewed forks with curiosity. Some considered them unnecessary luxuries. Others regarded them with mild suspicion. There were even churchmen who frowned upon forks, arguing that God had already provided perfectly suitable eating utensils at the ends of each arm. One cannot help admiring humanity's remarkable ability to transform cutlery into philosophical debate. So each guest produced a personal knife. Food arrived in larger portions than modern diners might expect. Meat was sliced individually. Bread was cut by hand. Cheese divided. Fruit peeled. The knife became part of the dining ritual itself. Sometimes people shared cups. Sometimes they shared plates called trenchers, often made from thick slices of stale bread. But the knife remained distinctly personal. This created an unexpectedly intimate relationship between owner and tool. You trusted its sharpness because you maintained it yourself. You knew exactly how it balanced. You understood how much pressure it required. rather like an experienced musician picking up a familiar instrument, or, perhaps more accurately, someone reaching automatically for their favorite kitchen knife, because all the others somehow feel slightly wrong. Of course, knives occasionally created awkward situations. Imagine sitting beside someone whose blade looked less than clean. Remember, medieval sanitation followed standards that modern health inspectors would describe using words unsuitable for relaxing bedtime listening. That knife may have cleaned fish yesterday, trimmed leather this morning, opened lunch 5 minutes ago, and now prepared dinner. Soap existed. People washed, but sterilization belonged to a future nobody could yet imagine. Thankfully, most healthy immune systems quietly worked overtime without demanding much appreciation. Perhaps they deserve a little applause across the centuries. As afternoon unfolds, our traveler continues walking. The road stretches through forests and open farmland. Soon he notices a loose leather strap on his satchel. No problem. Out comes the knife. A few careful cuts. Some quick trimming. Problem solved. A little later, he gathers kindling. Again the knife appears. Small branches become kindling. Twigs become cooking fuel. Later still, he purchases cheese wrapped in cloth. Knife again. String cut. Cheese sliced. Apple peeled. Day after day, dozens of tiny problems quietly surrendered before this modest blade. Modern advertisements love describing products as life-changing. Medieval people probably would not have spoken quite so dramatically. They simply understood something wonderfully practical. Life became extremely inconvenient without a sharp edge nearby. Farmers depended upon knives constantly, harvesting vegetables, cutting rope, repairing harnesses, preparing animal feed, removing damaged branches, cleaning freshly caught fish, opening sacks, shaping wooden pegs. Each task individually seemed small. Together, they filled nearly every working day. Workshops told similar stories. Carpenters shaped wood. Coopers trimmed barrel staves. Weavers cut thread. Shoemakers sliced leather. Tailors trimmed cloth. Every skilled craft quietly relied upon blades of varying sizes. Some professions developed specialized knives uniquely suited to their work. Others simply adapted familiar personal tools with impressive creativity. It becomes almost amusing to realize that while kings argued about kingdoms, countless ordinary people spent far more time wondering where they had last placed their knife. Lost kingdoms make exciting history books. Lost tools make extremely inconvenient Tuesdays. Pilgrims traveling toward famous shrines also treasured their knives. Long-distance travel remained exhausting. Roads ranged from acceptable to optimistic suggestions. Food needed preparation. Campfires required fuel. Walking sticks occasionally demanded reshaping. A dependable knife became both practical equipment and reassuring companion. Many pilgrims carried small belt pouches alongside their knives. Together, these modest possessions represented almost everything they truly owned during weeks or even months on the road. Imagine sleeping beneath the stars with little more than a blanket, a pouch of coins, a loaf of bread, and one carefully sharpened blade. Not because adventure sounded romantic, because survival required efficiency. Children encountered knives surprisingly early. Modern parents might raise eyebrows at the idea of giving a child a sharp blade. Medieval families viewed matters differently. Childhood involved gradual participation in adult work. Youngsters learned practical skills early. A small knife represented responsibility. It also represented trust. Naturally, accidents occurred. Children remain children regardless of century. Someone undoubtedly attempted to carve something unnecessarily ambitious. Someone else probably discovered that fingers and sharp edges maintain a complicated relationship. Human history is, among other things, an endless sequence of young people confidently believing, "This will probably be fine." Occasionally it was. Occasionally it became a valuable lesson. The remarkable thing is that these knives rarely inspired dramatic attention, precisely because they were so ordinary. Chronicles celebrated kings, poets praised warriors, monks recorded miracles. Nobody hurried home announcing, "You'll never believe what happened today. My knife successfully sliced another onion." Ordinary life rarely enters history books, yet ordinary life is where almost everyone actually lived. Millions woke, carried knives, worked, repaired belongings, prepared meals, sharpened blades, went to sleep, repeated tomorrow. Sometimes the smallest objects quietly reveal the largest truths, because if nearly every person carried one humble tool every single day, perhaps that tool tells us more about medieval civilization than another tale of castles and battles ever could. And as evening begins to settle across our imaginary village, as cooking fires flicker behind timber-framed houses and hundreds of tiny knives emerge one final time to prepare the day's last meal, another question slowly appears from the gathering darkness. If everyone carried a blade everywhere they went, why did medieval towns not descend into constant violence? The answer surprisingly reveals a society governed by unwritten expectations, strict customs, and a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of when a knife was simply a knife, and when it became something far more dangerous. As darkness settled over a medieval town, something rather interesting happened. The same knife that had spent the day peeling apples, trimming rope, repairing sandals, and quietly minding its own business, did not suddenly develop an irresistible desire to become a weapon. Contrary to what modern films might suggest, medieval streets were not filled with dramatic duels every 12 minutes. Most people were far too tired for that. They had fields to work, roofs to repair, children to feed, and livestock that possessed an astonishing talent for creating emergencies precisely when everyone wanted to sleep. The average villager understood a simple truth that still feels surprisingly modern. If you injured or killed your neighbor over something foolish, tomorrow's harvest became considerably more difficult. Communities survived through cooperation. The man whose sheep wandered into your garden today might be the same man helping repair your roof after the next storm. The woman who accidentally overcharged you for eggs at market might later become the midwife delivering your first child. Burning bridges in a village of perhaps 200 people was rather like drilling holes in the floor of your own house. Dramatic, certainly, but ultimately inconvenient for everyone involved. That does not mean violence never occurred. Human beings have always possessed the remarkable ability to transform small disagreements into unforgettable disasters. A disputed boundary stone, an insult offered after too much ale, an accusation of cheating at dice or someone's goat, developing an inexplicable fascination with another person's vegetables, could all escalate with alarming speed. History repeatedly demonstrates that civilization often hangs by the surprisingly fragile thread of people deciding not to overreact. Yet the knife itself occupied a curious place in medieval thinking. Carrying one was normal. Drawing it in anger was something entirely different. Many medieval towns developed regulations about weapons, especially within market districts. Visitors entering city gates during important fairs might be required to surrender larger swords or polearms to local authorities. Knives, however, often remained acceptable because everyone genuinely needed them. The baker required one. The fishmonger required one. The merchant opening bales of cloth required one. The traveler slicing bread required one. Society quietly depended upon thousands of tiny practical tasks that simply refused to cooperate without sharp edges. It created an interesting balance. Everyone possessed a potentially dangerous object, yet everyone also understood that using it carelessly invited severe consequences. Perhaps that sounds surprisingly civilized, or perhaps it simply demonstrates that people become remarkably polite when they know everyone else also owns a knife. One of the more fascinating discoveries made by archaeologists is just how many medieval knives have survived beneath old streets, marketplaces, rivers, and abandoned homes. Excavations across England, France, Germany, Scandinavia, and elsewhere continually uncover blades of astonishing variety. Some appear beautifully crafted with elegant ironwork and carefully shaped handles. Others are so plain they almost disappear among the surrounding soil, looking less like museum treasures and more like honest tools that simply worked until they no longer could. Their very abundance tells an important story. Knives were not rare possessions, they were ordinary. Imagine an archaeologist 1,000 years from now excavating the remains of one of our cities. They might discover countless teaspoons, bottle caps, charging cables, or kitchen scissors. Individually, none would seem remarkable. Together, however, they would reveal the rhythm of ordinary life. Medieval knives perform much the same service. They quietly whisper, "This is how people actually lived." One particularly charming detail involves dining etiquette. Medieval table manners existed despite popular myths, suggesting everyone simply grabbed food like enthusiastic raccoons at a picnic. In fact, courtesy manuals circulated among wealthier households, explaining proper behavior during meals. Do not wipe greasy fingers on the tablecloth. Do not spit across the table. Avoid scratching yourself while people are eating. Try not to blow your nose into your hand before reaching for shared food. Modern listeners may find these recommendations amusingly obvious. The medieval authors apparently felt they required repeating, which raises wonderfully uncomfortable questions about the events that inspired those instructions. Some manuals specifically advise diners to cut manageable pieces of meat, rather than stuffing enormous portions into their mouths. Others recommended offering the better portion of shared food to companions as a gesture of kindness. Even your personal knife participated in this quiet social performance. A sharp, clean blade reflected self-respect. Carelessly hacking food into ragged chunks suggested poor manners. It turns out medieval dining involved rather more grace than Hollywood usually allows, although admittedly, forks still remained stubbornly absent. Instead, many people used bread almost like edible utensils. Thick slices absorbed stew. Chunks scooped vegetables. Sauces disappeared into porous crusts. At the end of the meal, the bread itself might be eaten or given to servants, travelers, or the poor. Very little went to waste. Waste, after all, belonged primarily to people wealthy enough to afford it. The knife also occupied an unexpectedly emotional place within medieval families. Because it lasted for years, sometimes decades, it frequently passed from one generation to another. A father might present his son with a trusted blade upon reaching adulthood. A craftsman might leave favorite tools to apprentices. A widow might preserve her late husband's knife among his few remaining possessions. Unlike luxurious jewelry owned only by elites, these simple objects accumulated quiet family histories. Imagine holding the same knife your grandfather carried through 20 harvests. The handle polished smooth by 3 generations of hands. Tiny repairs made by different owners. The blade shortened slightly after years of sharpening. Metal slowly disappearing not through catastrophe, but through faithful service. History often celebrates spectacular treasures, yet perhaps these humble inheritances mattered far more to ordinary people. After all, crowns appeared rarely. Breakfast arrived every morning. Of course, knives occasionally wandered away from their owners in less sentimental ways. Markets proved particularly dangerous for absent-minded individuals. A busy merchant might set down his knife while examining cloth, only to remember it several stalls later. Pilgrims misplaced belongings during exhausting journeys. Children borrowed tools without announcing ambitious woodworking projects. Neighbors occasionally forgot whose knife belonged to whom. Human beings have demonstrated remarkable consistency across centuries in their relationship with misplaced possessions. One suspects medieval households experienced their own versions of "Has anyone seen my knife?" followed immediately by someone replying, "It was exactly where you left it," which naturally solved absolutely nothing. There were even small differences in knife styles, depending upon geography. Scandinavian knives often emphasized practical outdoor work. German examples sometimes displayed distinctive handle construction. English blades reflected local blacksmithing traditions. French workshops developed recognizable decorative details. Trade routes carried ideas alongside goods, allowing craftsmen to borrow successful designs from distant regions. Even without modern manufacturing styles evolved surprisingly quickly, people appreciated innovation. If someone designed a handle that fit more comfortably in the hand, neighbors noticed. Good ideas spread remarkably fast, even across muddy roads traveled mostly by horses and determined pedestrians. Blacksmiths therefore occupied an essential position within every community. Popular imagination frequently pictures them forging enormous swords amid showers of dramatic sparks. Certainly that happened, yet much of their daily work involved far less glamorous commissions. Horseshoes, nails, door hinges, cooking hooks, farm tools, and naturally, knives. Forging a quality blade demanded genuine skill. The smith heated iron until it glowed brilliant orange. Each hammer strike gradually shaped the metal. Too much force could weaken the blade. Too little left imperfections. Temperature mattered. Timing mattered. Experience mattered. Watching an accomplished smith work probably appeared almost effortless. which usually indicates someone spent decades mastering extremely difficult techniques. The finished blade then required careful sharpening, not excessively thin, not frustratingly dull. Finding exactly the right balance separated reliable tools from disappointing ones. Customers undoubtedly developed favorite blacksmiths. Reputation mattered enormously. A dependable blade justified higher prices because failure carried genuine consequences. Imagine traveling 50 miles through forests only to discover your knife snapping while preparing supper. Suddenly, craftsmanship became intensely personal. Interestingly, not everyone could afford newly forged knives. Some purchased second-hand blades. Others repaired damaged ones repeatedly. Broken handles received replacement scales. Bent tips straightened. Edges reshaped. A knife reaching modern archaeologists may already have lived several distinct lives before finally disappearing beneath centuries of accumulated earth. Perhaps its first owner was a farmer, its second a merchant, its third an apprentice carpenter. Objects quietly traveled through human stories long after names vanished. Metal itself remained precious. Unlike today's disposable culture, medieval Europe recycled astonishing amounts of iron. Broken knives rarely entered rubbish heaps immediately. Pieces became smaller tools, fragments reforged, damaged blades transformed into awls or chisels. Even worn-out metal retained value. Nothing useful disappeared casually. One could argue that medieval people practiced sustainability not because fashionable philosophers recommended it, but because replacing valuable materials cost real money. Necessity frequently proves a more persuasive teacher than environmental awareness. As twilight deepened, families gathered around hearth fires. Cooking pots simmered gently. Candles remained expensive. So many households relied primarily upon firelight. Inside those warm pools of orange light, knives emerged once more. Vegetables chopped, cheese sliced, bread divided, salt pork trimmed. Perhaps someone carved a little wooden toy while listening to stories. Perhaps another repaired worn leather boots. Perhaps an elderly grandfather patiently sharpened everyone's blades with slow practiced movements while grandchildren watched with fascinated respect. The knife was never simply a kitchen tool. It belonged to every corner of daily existence, and perhaps that is why medieval people rarely thought to describe it in great detail. It was as ordinary as breathing. History often hides its greatest secrets inside ordinary things. Kings announce themselves loudly. Empires erect monuments. Battles receive magnificent paintings. But a small knife hanging quietly from millions of belts tells an equally important story. It reminds us that civilizations survive less because of dramatic heroes than because ordinary people possess reliable tools and know how to use them. Tomorrow morning, another farmer will wake before sunrise. Another merchant will prepare for market. Another traveler will shoulder a pack. And before stepping into the world, each will instinctively reach toward the same familiar object resting at their side. Yet beneath this comforting routine lies another mystery that grows even stranger. Because while everyone understood how to carry a knife, remarkably few people ever expected to own a fork. The forgotten history of medieval eating habits reveals a world where entire meals unfolded according to customs that now seem almost unbelievably unfamiliar, transforming every dinner table into a fascinating lesson in practicality, status trust, and surprisingly complicated social etiquette. By modern standards, sitting down to a medieval meal would probably feel less like visiting a restaurant and more like joining an unusually polite camping trip. There were no carefully arranged place settings waiting patiently for each guest. No matching silverware glinting beneath soft candlelight. No reassuring collection of forks, steak knives, dessert spoons, and mysterious little utensils that everyone pretends to know how to use. Instead, you brought perhaps the single most important piece of dining equipment yourself, your knife. If you forgot it, dinner instantly became a far more creative exercise. The fascinating thing is that this arrangement felt completely normal. Nobody looked around wondering why the host had failed to provide cutlery. The host probably assumed every sensible adult had remembered to bring one. Forgetting your personal knife was rather like showing up to work today without shoes. Technically possible, but everyone would quietly question the sequence of decisions that brought you there. Meals in medieval Europe often revolved around large shared dishes rather than individual servings. A pot of thick pottage, part soup, part stew, part whatever happened to be available that week, might sit at the center of the table. Bread surrounded it, perhaps some onions. A wedge of cheese, if fortune smiled. Maybe salted pork or roasted chicken during festivals or prosperous seasons. Each person managed their own food with remarkable independence. The knife sliced, the fingers picked up, bread carried sauces, spoons, if available, handled liquids, forks remained curious outsiders. It is easy to forget just how revolutionary the table fork eventually became. Today, refusing to provide forks at dinner would seem like a rather aggressive social experiment. In much of medieval Europe, however, forks appeared suspiciously unnecessary. Some wealthy Byzantine households had used them for centuries. Italian merchants gradually encountered them through trade. A handful of aristocrats adopted them as fashionable novelties. Yet across Northern Europe, many people simply shrugged. Why complicate matters? God had provided hands. Knives already existed. Bread worked surprisingly well. Problem solved. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to become emotionally attached to familiar habits. Introduce a useful invention too early, and many will stare at it as though it personally insulted their ancestors. The fork suffered exactly this fate. Some churchmen even regarded it with open skepticism. According to one popular story, when a wealthy Byzantine princess used a golden fork while dining in Venice during the 11th century, certain religious figures criticized the practice as unnecessary luxury. Why reject fingers, they argued, if they were gifts from God? History never entirely confirms every colorful anecdote, but the broader attitude certainly existed. Imagine trying to convince someone that eating with a tiny metal rake represented progress, while they looked perfectly content tearing bread with their hands. Change arrives slowly, especially when lunch seems perfectly adequate already. Of course, medieval table manners were far from chaotic. Contrary to popular imagination, respectable households expected self-control. Courtesy books instructed diners not to grab the best pieces first. Do not reach across other people. Do not drink before swallowing your food. Avoid making alarming noises while chewing. Try not to inspect your nose too enthusiastically during dinner. And perhaps most importantly, Remember that everyone else also wished to enjoy the meal without witnessing unnecessary biological demonstrations. Some of these rules sound amusing precisely because they survive in written form. Someone had to write them down, which strongly suggests someone else kept violating them. Civilization often advances one awkward dinner guest at a time. Sharing food required trust. Consider a simple roasted chicken placed before several diners. No individual portions, no serving utensils. Each person used their own knife to cut manageable pieces. This demanded patience and cooperation. Take too much and everyone noticed. Hack carelessly through the meat and everyone noticed. Display graceful restraint and people quietly appreciated your manners. Dining became a performance of character. Even the way someone handled a knife revealed something about them. An experienced traveler could often judge social status surprisingly quickly, not solely by clothing, not solely by jewelry, but by posture, speech, confidence, and table habits accumulated over an entire lifetime. Now imagine attending a noble household. Everything grows more elaborate. The hall stretches wide beneath heavy timber beams. Candles flicker against painted walls. Servants move continuously. Dogs patrol hopefully beneath tables, fully convinced that gravity exists primarily to deliver roast meat into their mouths. Guests arrive carrying beautifully decorated knives. Some handles display carved ivory, others polished antler. Silver fittings glimmer softly. These are still practical tools, but they also quietly communicate wealth. Luxury rarely misses an opportunity to decorate usefulness. Rich people across history have consistently discovered methods of making ordinary objects astonishingly expensive. A spoon, a shoe, a chair, a knife. Add enough precious metal and artistic craftsmanship, and suddenly practical equipment becomes conversation. The knife itself remained deeply personal. Guests rarely exchanged them. Doing so would feel unexpectedly intimate. After all, this tool accompanied its owner nearly every day. It rested at their belt, prepared their meals, completed their work, perhaps even traveled hundreds of miles. Ownership became almost an extension of identity. This personal relationship also meant people learned excellent knife skills from constant practice. Modern cooks often spend years improving chopping techniques. Medieval adults accumulated thousands upon thousands of hours using blades for every imaginable purpose. Their movements became efficient almost without conscious thought. Slice, trim, peel, carve, repeat. Much as experienced knitters no longer watch their own hands. Seasoned medieval workers probably manipulated knives while holding conversations, listening to stories, or planning tomorrow's work. Practice quietly transforms complexity into instinct. Children observed this process from astonishingly young ages. Long before receiving their own knife, they watched adults using one dozens of times each day. Preparing vegetables, sharpening steaks, repairing baskets, whittling toys, cleaning fish, opening sacks, removing bark. The knife became one of childhood's earliest practical lessons. Eventually, a parent judged the moment right, perhaps around 7 or 8, perhaps older depending upon maturity. A small knife appeared. Responsibility arrived alongside it. No formal graduation ceremony, no inspirational speech, simply quiet trust. Here, learn carefully. Try not to cut yourself, or your brother, or the dog. Although the dog, judging from medieval illustrations, probably possessed considerably more common sense than some younger siblings. Learning to use a knife safely represented growing independence. A child who could prepare simple food, carve useful objects, or assist with repairs gradually contributed to family survival. Modern childhood often emphasizes education through books. Medieval childhood blended education with immediate usefulness. Neither approach entirely excludes the other. They simply answer different questions. One asks, what should this child know? The other asks, what can this child do today? Another fascinating aspect involves travel. Long-distance journeys demanded constant adaptability. Roads remained rough. Weather ignored personal schedules. Equipment broke. Meals varied wildly. Travelers therefore relied heavily upon versatile possessions. A single knife replaced numerous specialized tools impossible to carry conveniently. Picture a merchant crossing northern France. Morning begins with bread and cheese. Knife required. Midday brings damaged harness straps. Knife required. Evening camp demands kindling. Knife required. Tomorrow, someone wishes to trade cloth. String must be cut. Knife required. By week's end, perhaps the blade has peeled fruit, repaired shoes, carved tent pegs, cleaned fish, trimmed feathers into writing quills, and opened several stubborn packages. One tiny object quietly performs more occupations than many modern office workers. The knife accompanied pilgrims too. Religious journeys filled medieval Europe. Some walked to Canterbury. Others traveled towards Santiago de Compostela. Some ventured astonishing distances toward Rome or Jerusalem. Pilgrims packed lightly. Every ounce mattered. Consequently, each possession justified its place. The knife easily earned inclusion. Without it, preparing food became awkward. Minor repairs became frustrating. Unexpected opportunities became missed opportunities. Versatility always wins arguments against unnecessary weight. One unexpectedly charming detail appears in medieval artwork. Artists frequently painted ordinary people holding knives during entirely peaceful activities, not threatening anyone, not defending castles, simply eating lunch, preparing vegetables, carving wood, working. To medieval eyes, this looked completely ordinary. Modern viewers, conditioned by centuries of cinema, sometimes misinterpret these scenes. We instinctively expect tension. The medieval artist intended normality. It reminds us how easily our assumptions distort another culture. Sometimes, history's greatest mystery lies not in the past itself, but in the modern imagination, insisting everything must be more dramatic than it really was. Of course, accidents remained unavoidable. Sharp tools occasionally reminded users that concentration matters. Medical texts mention cuts. Legal documents occasionally describe injuries. Parents undoubtedly sighed as children learned painful lessons. Some craftsmen probably accumulated enough tiny scars to remember every careless afternoon of their apprenticeships. The remarkable part is not that accidents happened. It is that people accepted them as ordinary risks attached to useful work. A dull knife often proved more dangerous than a sharp one. This remains true today. A properly sharpened blade obeys. A dull blade resists slips and suddenly develops surprising enthusiasm for visiting fingers. Medieval people understood this perfectly. Regular sharpening therefore became routine. Many households owned whetstones. Others visited professional sharpeners. Traveling craftsmen occasionally offered sharpening services in busy marketplaces. Maintaining a blade required patience. Too much grinding shortened its life unnecessarily. Too little invited frustration. There was genuine satisfaction in restoring a tired edge until it sliced effortlessly once more. Perhaps we underestimate how comforting such small rituals become. Sharpening a trusted knife after supper, oiling a wooden handle, inspecting the blade beneath firelight. Quiet tasks repeated hundreds of evenings across an entire lifetime. History often feels loud because textbooks naturally favor battles, revolutions, and kings shouting ambitious speeches. Real life sounded different, more scraping than shouting, more chopping than charging, more quiet maintenance than dramatic conquest. And somewhere inside almost every medieval household, while wind whispered outside and fire crackled softly within, somebody sat patiently caring for one humble knife that would faithfully serve again tomorrow. Yet this ordinary companion held another remarkable secret, one that reached beyond kitchens and workshops into the very heart of medieval identity. Because a person's knife could reveal not only what they did for a living, but who they were, where they came from, how wealthy they might be, and even whether others considered them trustworthy. In a world where nearly everyone carried a blade, the smallest details could quietly speak volumes before a single word was ever exchanged.
By the time a medieval traveller had walked into a village square, tied his horse to a post, brushed the dust from his boots, and greeted the nearest merchant observant, people had already begun forming opinions about him, not because they had spoken at length, but because medieval society had become remarkably skilled at reading tiny details. His cloak might reveal the quality of the wool. His boots might hint at the distance he had travelled. His hands could suggest whether he spent his life behind a plough at a workbench or balancing ledgers. And hanging quietly from his belt, almost unnoticed by modern eyes, was his knife. To medieval people, that knife could tell its own story. A wealthy merchant might carry a finely finished blade with polished horn scales and elegant brass rivets. It was still practical, but there was no denying that someone had invested both money and pride into it. A village carpenter's knife often looked entirely different. Its handle might be darkened by years of sweat, the blade slightly shorter than when it was first forged, gradually worn away after countless sharpenings. Tiny scratches crossed its surface like a map of forgotten afternoons. Perhaps there was a nick near the tip from an unfortunate encounter with a stubborn oak knot 20 years earlier. No one remembered the incident anymore. The knife did. Objects in their quiet way often become historians. Meanwhile, a shepherd's knife usually reflected another kind of life altogether. Its blade might carry faint stains from trimming wool, cutting reeds, repairing leather straps, slicing bread beside lonely hillsides, or preparing simple meals while watching sheep drift across rolling fields. Nothing about it appeared glamorous, yet every mark represented another ordinary day successfully completed. Modern museums frequently display magnificent jeweled swords beneath carefully controlled lighting. Visitors gather around them, admiring the glittering symbols of kings and famous warriors. Those weapons certainly deserve attention. But somewhere beneath the same layers of history lie thousands of plain working knives that probably accomplished far more actual labor than all the ceremonial swords combined. History loves celebrities. Civilization usually survives because ordinary people quietly keep doing ordinary work. There is something wonderfully humbling about that. One fascinating archaeological discovery after another has reinforced this truth. Excavations in medieval London, York, Paris, Lubeck, Cologne, and dozens of other ancient towns have uncovered astonishing numbers of everyday knives. Not hidden treasure, not sacred relics. Simply the tools people misplaced, dropped into rivers, lost beneath floorboards, forgotten in collapsed houses, buried inside rubbish pits. The sheer quantity surprises researchers. Some excavation sites produce hundreds of blades, others reveal thousands. Each one belonged to someone whose name has almost certainly disappeared forever. Yet through these forgotten possessions, their routines quietly survive. Perhaps one belonged to a baker who woke before dawn every morning, another to a widow supporting 3 children by spinning wool, another to an apprentice who nervously carved his first successful wooden spoon. One might have accompanied a pilgrim all the way to Canterbury, another perhaps never travelled farther than 3 neighbouring villages. Each knife represents an invisible biography. History usually remembers famous speeches. Archaeology remembers lunch. There is an odd comfort in that. The more historians study medieval daily life, the more they discover that ordinary people often cared very little about the dramatic political events filling modern textbooks. Imagine telling a blacksmith in rural France that historians 800 years later would devote entire university courses to disputes between kings. He might nod politely, then ask whether you also plan to discuss why his new shipment of iron had arrived late, because that affected tomorrow's work. The king's latest argument probably did not. Daily survival tends to rearrange priorities. The knife sat directly in the middle of those priorities. It belonged neither entirely to work nor entirely to leisure. It crossed every boundary. A woman preparing vegetables for supper used hers. An old man carving children's toys used his. A fisherman cleaning his morning catch used his. A monk trimming goose feathers into writing quills used his. A tailor cutting cloth. A cooper shaping barrels. A shepherd repairing fences. A traveller sharing bread. The same simple object connected lives that otherwise seem completely different. Even monks whose lives followed strict religious routines relied heavily upon knives. Monasteries often functioned like small, self-contained communities. They baked bread, made cheese, copied books, maintained gardens, produced wine, repaired buildings, crafted furniture, prepared medicines. Each activity quietly demanded cutting tools. Imagine a medieval scribe sitting patiently beside a narrow window. Sunlight falls across a sheet of parchment. Beside him rests a small knife, not for defense, for precision. It trims quills, scrapes away mistakes in fresh ink, smooths parchment surfaces, removes tiny imperfections before another careful line of Latin begins. Without that little blade, many surviving medieval manuscripts might never have existed. It seems almost poetic. One knife helps prepare dinner, another helps preserve philosophy, both equally necessary in their own way. Some knives became surprisingly beautiful despite remaining practical. Craftsmen occasionally engraved simple geometric patterns into blades. Others carved delicate decorations into bone handles. Religious symbols appeared. Crosses, saints, protective inscriptions. Not because decoration improved cutting ability, because humans possess an almost irresistible desire to surround useful things with beauty. We decorate cups, cars, phones, pens. Apparently medieval people looked at an ordinary knife and thought, you know what this needs? A carefully carved little bird. And honestly, who could blame them? Beauty often sneaks into the most practical corners of life. There were also regional fashions. In Northern Europe, some handles remained deliberately plain. Elsewhere, decorative brass caps became popular. Certain blade shapes appeared more frequently in one kingdom than another. Trade carried these designs astonishing distances. Merchants transported not merely goods but ideas. One blacksmith noticed an unfamiliar handle design brought from another region. He tried it himself. Customers approved. Soon neighbouring workshops copied it. Innovation did not require internet connections, just curious craftsmen and long roads. Of course, not every knife reflected prosperity. Many poorer labourers owned blades repaired so many times that they scarcely resembled their original form. Handles replaced, tips reshaped, edges shortened, rivets changed, metal patched. The knife survived because replacing it entirely remained expensive. This reveals something deeply different from our own culture. Modern manufacturing encourages replacement. Something breaks, buy another. Medieval life encouraged persistence. Something breaks, fix it. If possible, fix it again, and perhaps once more. The result was a world filled with possessions carrying long personal histories. Your bowl, your boots, your belt, your knife. Each accumulated repairs like quiet badges of endurance. There is something strangely comforting about imagining a society that expected objects to grow old alongside their owners. The knife also accompanied people into moments of celebration. Village fairs bustled with music traders, storytellers, and wandering entertainers. Food stalls offered roasted meats, pies, pastries, cheeses, nuts, fruit, and ale. Visitors naturally reached for their own knives while eating. Nobody considered this remarkable. Children watched jugglers while absent-mindedly slicing apples. Travellers shared sausages beneath colourful tents. Friends passed around fresh bread. The knife participated just as comfortably in festivals as it did in lonely work days. Even weddings featured them. Guests carried personal blades. Feasts involved enormous quantities of food requiring constant cutting and sharing. The knife quietly attended births, marriages, harvest celebrations, pilgrimages, market days, funerals, and ordinary Tuesday suppers alike. Few possessions witnessed so much of human life. Perhaps only clothing came close. Then there were the stories. Folk tales occasionally gave knives symbolic meaning. A faithful blade represented honesty. A broken blade warned of betrayal. Gifting a knife sometimes carried subtle implications depending on local traditions. Across Europe, little superstitions emerged. Some believed giving a knife directly might cut a friendship, unless the receiver offered a small coin in return. Interestingly, versions of this belief survive in several cultures even today. Apparently, humans have spent centuries worrying that cutlery might accidentally interfere with relationships. We truly possess limitless imagination, and yet beneath all these traditions remained one undeniable fact. The knife never stopped being ordinary. That is perhaps its greatest lesson. It reminds us that civilizations are not built solely by emperors issuing commands or knights winning glorious victories. They are built every morning by people preparing breakfast, repairing roofs, sharpening tools, carving bowls, feeding children, opening sacks of grain, cutting rope, solving one small practical problem after another. Sometimes the quietest objects reveal the loudest truths. The humble medieval knife asks us to look beyond castles and battlefields into kitchens, workshops, forests, farms, monasteries, and market squares, into the places where almost everyone actually lived. And as the centuries passed, those countless blades slowly wore shorter and thinner, until eventually they disappeared into the soil beneath abandoned houses, forgotten roads, and quiet riverbanks. There they rested untouched for hundreds of years, waiting patiently beneath layers of earth, until curious hands would one day uncover them again. In that peaceful silence, stripped of the voices that once carried them from dawn until dusk, these little knives became something far greater than tools. They became tiny messengers from ordinary lives, reminding us that history is rarely written by the objects people admired most, but by the ones they simply could not live without. And perhaps that is the quietest surprise of all. When most of us picture the Middle Ages, our minds immediately wander toward towering castles, armoured knights charging across muddy fields, glittering crowns, dramatic betrayals, and kings making decisions that somehow managed to inconvenience millions of people they would never actually meet. History books have always adored those stories. They are exciting, loud, full of names and dates and spectacular moments that fit neatly into timelines. But if you could quietly slip through time unnoticed and spend just one ordinary day in a medieval village, you would probably discover something much smaller hanging from almost every belt. Not a sword, not a royal seal, not a treasure map, just a knife. A simple little tool that woke up with its owner before sunrise and rarely left their side until sleep finally arrived. It helped prepare breakfast before the rooster had entirely committed to being awake. It trimmed loose threads from clothing. It repaired harnesses. It sliced apples gathered from nearby orchards. It cut herbs growing beside cottages. It shaped wooden toys for impatient children. It carved pegs for fences that stubbornly refused to stay upright. It cleaned fish, opened sacks, sharpened quills, peeled onions, trimmed leather, prepared firewood kindling, and quietly solved dozens of tiny problems before lunchtime had even begun. Nobody sang songs about these accomplishments. No chronicler carefully recorded that one particularly reliable knife successfully cut bread for 32 consecutive years. History generally prefers kings arguing with one another. The knife simply kept making lunch possible. And perhaps that is why it feels strangely familiar. Even today, our own lives are held together by ordinary objects we rarely notice. A favourite coffee mug, an old pair of comfortable shoes, a worn kitchen knife inherited from a grandparent, a pen that somehow always writes better than every expensive replacement. We become attached to useful things, not because they are glamorous, because they quietly accompany us through ordinary life. The medieval knife belonged to that comforting category. It earned affection rather than admiration. The deeper we explore medieval Europe, the more we realize that ordinary people were astonishingly practical. Popular culture sometimes portrays them as permanently confused, endlessly superstitious, or somehow incapable of sensible thought. Reality proves considerably more interesting. Certainly they believed things that sound unusual to modern ears. Certainly they misunderstood many aspects of science, but they also displayed remarkable intelligence in solving daily problems using limited resources. A knife that could perform 20 different tasks represented brilliant efficiency. When replacing possessions required weeks of wages and countless hours of skilled labor, versatility became one of the greatest luxuries imaginable. There is a quiet wisdom hidden inside that way of thinking. Modern life often encourages specialization. One tool for every task, one gadget for every inconvenience. Entire drawers filled with objects used perhaps twice each year. The medieval world leaned in the opposite direction. One dependable object. Know it well. Care for it properly. Use it creatively. Perhaps neither approach is entirely right or wrong, but one certainly requires less storage space. As evening settled across medieval Europe, villages gradually disappeared beneath darkness. Smoke drifted lazily from cottage chimneys. Dogs curled beside warm hearths. Children finally surrendered their endless energy. The day's work softened into memory. Somewhere inside thousands of homes, knives were cleaned almost absent-mindedly before being returned to belts, shelves, or simple wooden pegs near the fire. Tomorrow they would begin again. The owners probably gave them very little thought. Familiarity often hides importance. Only when something disappears do we suddenly understand how much we depended upon it. Archaeologists centuries later patiently brushed soil away from forgotten blades resting beneath abandoned streets. The people who once carried them had long since vanished. Languages evolved. Kingdoms disappeared. Roads shifted. Forests reclaimed old villages. Yet these small pieces of iron remained. Quiet, patient, waiting. Unlike magnificent castles, they asked for no admiration. Unlike jeweled crowns, they demanded no protection. Unlike famous swords displayed behind museum glass, they carried no legendary names. They simply existed. And because they existed, ordinary life became visible again. Perhaps that is the greatest gift archaeology gives us. Not grand monuments, ordinary mornings, not emperors, neighbors, not famous victories. Dinner, the humble knife, gently reminds us that history was never truly built by extraordinary people alone. It was built by millions of ordinary hands repeating ordinary tasks with extraordinary consistency. A farmer planting another field, a carpenter shaping another beam, a mother slicing another loaf of bread, a traveller repairing another broken strap, a monk trimming another quill before copying another page. Civilization grows quietly, one practical decision after another. There is something deeply reassuring about that thought. Our own lives often feel filled with small responsibilities that seem almost invisible. Preparing meals, fixing things around the house, helping family members, running errands, doing laundry. Answering messages, tidying rooms that somehow become untidy again almost immediately, as though socks and coffee mugs secretly hold nighttime meetings to reorganize themselves. None of these moments appear especially historic. Neither did sharpening a knife beside a medieval fire. Yet together they form the fabric of human existence. Perhaps history has always lived less in spectacular events than in ordinary routines. And perhaps that realization is strangely comforting. Because if countless anonymous people quietly shape the world through simple daily acts, then maybe our own quiet routines matter more than we sometimes imagine. The medieval knife never expected applause. It simply kept helping, year after year, generation after generation, until finally both tool and owner surrendered themselves to time. Now 8 centuries later, we remember them not because they conquered kingdoms, but because they reveal something beautifully human. People have always searched for practical solutions. They have always repaired what they could, shared meals, worked hard, loved their families, complained about difficult weather, misplaced important belongings, borrowed tools without returning them quite as quickly as promised. And somehow, despite everything, they kept moving forward. The centuries between us suddenly feel much shorter. The castles may have crumbled, the marketplaces fallen silent, the roads become grassy paths, the blacksmith's forge long since cooled. But the quiet rhythm of ordinary life continues. carried from one generation to the next in ways so familiar that we often forget how ancient they truly are. So tonight, as you rest beneath a roof far warmer and brighter than most medieval homes could ever have imagined, perhaps allow yourself one small smile for the humble knife that accompanied countless forgotten lives. It was never the hero of the story. It never wanted to be. It simply helped ordinary people greet another sunrise. And in doing so, it quietly became one of the most faithful companions in medieval history. Now the fire has burned low. The last conversation has faded into comfortable silence. Outside, the night stretches gently across fields where travelers no longer pass with little blades hanging from their belts. The workshops are still. The market stalls have vanished into memory. The hands that once held those well-worn knives have returned to the earth, leaving behind only tiny traces for history to uncover. Their worries are finished. Their work is done. And just as their long, busy days eventually gave way to peaceful rest, may your own thoughts grow softer, quieter, and lighter. The world can wait until morning. For now, simply breathe. Let the weight of today drift away and allow yourself to follow history into the calm, gentle silence where even the busiest lives finally come to rest. Sweet dreams.